Hi, my name is Rita Merlo, and this is Emily Sanchez. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the movie Contagion.
Yeah, so my reaction to Contagion, just watching it, I was like, okay, this is so similar to COVID and like what we're going through right now, and just not being out of the woods with COVID. I think it gave me like a new perspective as far as watching the movie, and it's not so out there a Hollywood rendition of an outbreak. We're kind of living it right now. So that definitely kind of like gave me the lens through which I was like watching the movie and comparing it to like what we're doing right now and how the government is dealing with things and people. I was just kind of like looking at those similarities and differences the whole time.
And I thought the movie was incredibly accurate to how the COVID-19 pandemic happened. It's just crazy that this movie was put out like about 10 years prior to COVID. I was really blown away by how they tied it all together. Like it came full circle, showed how one person's actions panned out to eventually affect the entire world. So I thought that was a really cool message that the movie gave. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a synopsis of the movie. So Contagion covers a fictional pandemic outbreak from the MEV1 virus. It had a really acute onset. The virus would invade host central nervous system and lung tissues, causing acute respiratory distress syndromes like seizures, coma, and ultimately death. The movie really cues in on the extremely rapid transmissibility of the virus and its rapid effects. The WHO is able to trace the origins of the virus back to Hong Kong, while the CDC isolates and grows the virus to come up with a vaccine. The main conflicts of the movies are about the struggles of the individuals taking on burdens of containing the pandemic, as well as the mass hysteria that ensues all over society. And there's even a pushback against the vaccine. Ultimately, the virus came from a bat reservoir that transmitted to a pig and mutated into a highly communicable lethal variant.
Isn't that so crazy? I mean, just like the similarities right there with COVID. I was seriously sitting there like, wow, like, did they have some kind of foresight?
Right.
We're going to go into like the significance of the characters. And I thought it was interesting because you and I have similar answers and some, and then they varied a little bit. For me, there was two sides, kind of like good guy, bad guy. And I would ultimately say that the research scientist, Allie, who was gutsy enough to give herself the vaccine that worked on the monkeys, is the most significant character, I think, as far as the outcome of the entire pandemic, because she was working behind the scenes the whole time. She really didn't get any like credit or acknowledgement. She was just going to work every day and doing her job and studying this thing like sun up to sundown until they could come up with a vaccine that was viable. So we kind of discussed earlier how like this isn't really accurate to what would happen in the real world, but nonetheless, she probably to me has the most significant role. And then on like the other side of the coin to that, the internet blogger, writer who was sparking this distrust in the vaccine was also like super significant, because they talk about it in the movie. They're like, there's 12 million people, quote, like as crazy as you are. So it's not like his opinion was just small. He actually had this huge reach to people, and that could potentially just keep the virus, the pandemic going, because this many people believe that the vaccine was a hoax, and kind of like all these conspiracy theories started coming to the surface, and he was really like propelling those. So maybe the antagonist, but I think he had a really significant role.
Dr. Ali Hextall was definitely a big character in this movie. The way that she created the vaccine and took on so many personal risks, I think shows that she had a really significant role in changing the course of the virus. Even though you don't see much of her in the film, the Gwyneth Paltrow character, her name is Beth Emhoff, I thought she was in a way the most important character, just because she was patient zero and the whole pandemic really did start from her, and it was really her that was that main patient that just spread it around to what ended up being a global pandemic.
Seeing it all come together and just like how rapid it spread from one person was like mind-blowing. So where do we think that the outbreak started, and then who or what started it? I think the movie like alluded to this in the end, kind of, I mean, explained it. I think the whole time we're thinking like, what really happened? And like, was it her? Or did like one of the initial characters you see like started? I think your mind starts going there like immediately, like what happened. But I thought it was so interesting, like that everything came full circle. They showed the bulldozer from her Gwyneth Paltrow's company that she works for, contributing to deforestation in the jungle, and that altered the flight pattern of a bat that was in the tree that carried a piece of food over a pig enclosure. Then the pig consumed that, like dropping from the bat. And then next you see like them processing that pig for food. The chef that is like touching that pig doesn't wash his hands. He just like rubs it on his apron and then goes to shake hands with Gwyneth Paltrow. And then you're like, oh my God, like that is what happened. And it seemed like so simple like that. But if you think about like the chain of events that happened, it was just kind of like that domino effect. So then from there, they just show you like Gwyneth Paltrow touching glasses and hands and coughing and sneezing and just like transmitting it through that casino. And then from there, just everyone that those people came into contact with. And then it became a pandemic, like sooner than later. But I just thought it was like interesting to note the similarity here and like what happens with the virus. So I think what they're kind of like insinuating is that the bat was a reservoir for the virus. And so it wasn't affected by it. Whatever the bat was carrying, it wasn't like lethal to it. And there was like a genetic recombination there in the pig that then could be transmitted to humans and cause the significant illness. And that is kind of similar to what we saw with the H1N1 outbreak in 2009. This like recombination of genetics in a virus that became very transmissible to humans from pigs and birds. So I thought that was like a very interesting connect as far as nursing care and interventions for patients in this outbreak. So like you mentioned before, Rita, the patients in this movie were fighting like severe respiratory as well as central nervous system symptoms. The most severe, I think that they were saying was kind of like this encephalitis that the virus caused that would cause seizures and comas. It's especially that one scene where were doing the autopsy of Gwyneth Paltrow and they like were looking at her brain and it totally freaked the doctors out. I was like, what did they see? Like, you know, and I wanted them to like elaborate more on that. I found a few articles and it's interesting to note that there is also like a similarity to COVID-19 and kind of like what nurses can do for COVID patients and then what we would do maybe for these patients in the movie. But something that was very significant during COVID and what I could see being done for these patients because of the acute respiratory distress syndrome was the increased use of prone positioning in patients. And so I found a few articles regarding just like the significance of prone positioning and explaining what it does, how it could improve the outcomes in patients. They also did mention in some of these that a patient has to be the right candidate for proning. And also proning takes a lot of like manpower to do and a lot of time. So there was actually teams of people that would have to go and turn patients like multiple times a day and monitor them because you're not seeing kind of like their face and like common signs that you know of a patient's condition. It just changes when they're in the prone position. But I could see that being one of the interventions that we would do as nurses for these patients because of like the severe respiratory symptoms that they were experiencing. Regarding the seizures, so there is not a lot to like prevent seizures. Medications and surgery are like the go-to as far as like treating epilepsy disorders, which would kind of be like what we saw in the movie. The best interventions found and what I found was tied to like sudden death related to epilepsy. Researchers found that the utmost importance is having like a 3-minute or less time response to a patient if they were to go into like cardiorespiratory arrest following a seizure. So just having like a quick response is really important. And then also they found that patients would be already in the prone position after a seizure, like in their postictal state or aspirating. But something I thought was interesting that could tie to taking care of patients in the movie was that since we want to prone patients anyways, these researchers for this study suggested using kind of like lattice structured pillows. So it allows like air to move through the fabric so it doesn't obstruct it. So suffocating was like less of a problem or a concern. So I was like, okay, well, if a patient is having respiratory symptoms and central nervous system symptoms and seizures, we would want to prone them for their lungs and to improve like the ventilation and perfusion. And then maybe use those kinds of like pillows or something of that nature, or like putting them on their side would even help with a seizure and maybe like the lung perfusion issue. So I just kind of was thinking that those would be like the two main interventions that we could focus on as far as like taking care of patients with those very different sets of symptoms, but also like both very severe at the same time.
I am going to tie this movie into current nursing practice. Contagion is very similar in the way that the pandemic unfolded. So just the panic, the lack of supplies, and the increasing number of cases. I wouldn't say that the movie focused on nursing per se. It more looked at the pandemic more on the level of the CDC, epidemiologists, and virologists. But I'm going to go over some of the aspects of the movie that could tie in with nursing practice today. So one would be the importance of mental health. So in Contagion, the character of Dr. Cheever of the CDC consistently checked in with Dr. Erin Mears, who's played by Kate Winslet, about her mental health. So he would even say, I remember the scene where he asked how she was doing, not what she is doing. Within the pandemic, I think mental health has been a huge issue. I found an article titled Life in the Pandemic by Deborah Jackson, which stated, of critical importance will be nurses' responses to the increased anxiety and mental health needs of the population, as well as within the nursing community, which I really can't agree with more. There's also the issue of equal access to healthcare. As nurses, we must believe that all people deserve access to healthcare. And in Contagion, there's a scene where a Chinese government official named Sun Feng kidnaps Dr. Leonora Orantes from the WHO as a ransom in order to help his rural village obtain vaccines. So this goes to show how he really felt that because his village was a rural little village, that he felt that they would be the last in line to really get the help that they needed from this virus. And I was able to find this article that went over an idea of rural communities, but this article was about rural Japanese communities having less access to healthcare. And this quote said, the rural communities in Japan are facing significant human resources shortages due to urbanization and the decreasing population in rural communities. Therefore, if there are no medical and nursing professionals entering the rural communities in the coming decade, a large number of citizens, particularly senior citizens, will lose their basic caring services, which is so true. I think we're seeing with this pandemic, just those people who are out in those rural areas really have such a decreased chance of getting access to excellent healthcare like we have here in the cities. The final concept that I'd like to tie this movie into is evidence-based practice, which is critical to nursing. So most of the movie Contagion was focusing about gathering evidence, like finding patient zero, gathering information about the virus, and developing a vaccine. The way that the vaccine was implemented was not really indicative of evidence-based practice. It really was dramatic. You know, the doctor, Ali Hextall, basically saw one monkey survive from her vaccine prototype and then ended up giving that to herself, which unleashed the vaccine onto the entire population. I don't know if they went through any testing behind the scenes, but it just seemed very rushed. And although our current vaccine was also rushed, I do know that we went through at least some set of tests before putting it out into the public. And so I think it's just so important to have that evidence if you're going to have the human population start taking something. I found an article about nursing practices, and it was talking about the pandemic and the challenges in implementing evidence-based practice, which it states several variables interfere in professional practice, such as epidemiological aspects, working conditions, and care management in a pandemic. The pandemic scenario has taken nursing to a position of practical and scientific protagonism as a result of its proactivity and leadership in the search for knowledge based on scientific evidence, which just really drives home the point of being able to care for people using the evidence-based practice will be better off for everybody. As nurses, we will emphasize the importance of mental health, equal access to healthcare, and evidence-based practice throughout our careers. My takeaway from Contagion was just that it really showed the value of those frontline workers, and it was just so accurate in its prediction of how a pandemic unfolded. So in some ways it was very humbling because we think as society we're so advanced and we have everything in order, but it really showed the weak links in our government and healthcare. So that was my main takeaway from Contagion.
I agree with like all those points. I think it's so important to tie it back to like our future practice and what are we going to do in like the face of this situation. I think my main takeaway is like I appreciate science so much and people that work very hard to literally protect like the whole world. I know I read some like outside articles about the WHO weighing in and like the CDC and like contact tracers kind of like weighing in on Contagion and just saying like, yeah, there are these people that work very hard, tirelessly to trace the origins of disease and just like commit like their career to containing something so it doesn't cause this like huge mass outbreak, because like you said, there's definitely like weak points that will always be exposed when something like this happens, whether it's in the government or healthcare. And I feel like at the end of the day, like nurses and healthcare workers, everyone is just like human, and there's only so much that like you can take as a worker in like contributing and doing your part, you know? So I think I just really appreciate like the science and like the virologists and the research scientists that were like looking at developing the vaccine, and then just like the continuous knowledge that we keep getting from science as far as like, okay, this is what we learned, this is what we can do with that information, and every day we're just going to continue to like study this and learn and like try and be better and like save more lives. Yeah. Thank you so much for watching. That was just like our take on this whole thing and what's going on today.
Thanks for watching.